Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Danton Remoto.
I'm sorry I was late. I came from Fairview. I left the house at 11 a.m. No? May nagbangga ang dalawang truck na kasyabu yata sila. So, we start with Dr. Butch Dalisay. Si Butch was my teacher in UP. He didn't give me a 1. He gave me a 1.25. Si Jing, hindi 1 ako dyan eh. Oh, I'll give you the floor na, Butch.
Thank you. Thank you, Danton. Magandang hapon sa inyong lahat. It's great to be among old friends, no pun intended. Except for Danton, as the youngest member of this August group, I was going to suggest that we should do this chronologically. I mean, from oldest to youngest, because believe it or not, there are important differences in experience and opinion between 60-year-olds and 70-year-olds. But so as not to upset the given order, I'll begin with just a few general observations. I think we agreed that we would just kind of talk off the cuff for about 5 to 10 minutes each or so we will have more time for questions from you. I just said that there may be some differences in mid-generation among us. I, for example, belong to that cusp between the 1960s and the 1970s in terms of the time when we kind of came into our own as writers. And I don't think too many people will remember this, but that was a seminal break from the kind of freewheeling, free-loving, bohemian 60s that my friend Krip was very much a part of, to the Spartan, Puritan, holier-than-thou, Marxist 1970s that I belonged to. And a very important sea change happened there, both in our persons and in our writing. Of course, today, that divide has kind of melted over, and we've reconciled a lot of the very different feelings that we had about writing since then. But to just bring up a few points about the way we wrote, and again, I should qualify we, in my case, as someone who began writing in the late 60s, early 70s. I sold my first television play in 1970 when I was 16. And by 1972, I was a full-time journalist. I quit school, I dropped out of school to write for the Philippines Herald and for Taliba. My first observation is that we wrote everything. And by everything, I mean we wrote not just poetry, fiction, and plays, but we wrote news stories, we were journalists. I think most of us have had a background in journalism. We wrote news, we wrote features, and later on we would write screenplays, we wrote radio scripts. In other words, we wrote anything that could put some cash in our pockets and food on the table. We weren't writing just for love, we were writing for a living. And for me, that was the most important lesson of my young life, that you could actually make a living out of writing. I mean, you could love it for its own sake, and of course, there's a part of me that does. And I reserve that love mainly for my fiction. But the point is that we didn't go around, I didn't go around saying, like at 16 or 17, I'm a playwright. Or, you know, in the way that these days some young folks come up to me, you know, in their early 20s and proudly declare, and I can't blame them, and they say, I'm a poet. You know? We were just writers, and writers wrote all kinds of things. There was no such thing as specialization then. At hindi lang kami nagsusulat sa English. Natuto kami magsulat sa Filipino. Dahil lalo-lalo na nung naging aktivista ako, again, a very important shift yun. And I was barely out of high school, and in high school we were reading things, of course, like Catcher in the Rye, and The Little Prince was very big. And from that kind of milieu, pasok ka ngayon sa, you know, Philippine Society and Revolution. So, and quotations of Chairman Mao, talks at the Yan'an Forum. So radical shift in the way you look at literature and at your audience, and even at your own language. Natuto lang talaga ako managalog. Basically, nung naging aktivista ako eh. Kasi kailangan ko na ngayong magsulat ng mga manifesto sa Pilipino. Dati-dati, talagang Inglesero lang ako sa Lasal. And that brings me to the point that I think we wrote about class. Whether we were writers, whether we were activists or not, whether we were writing in English or Filipino, I think there was a distinct class consciousness, or at least awareness, in whatever we wrote. This doesn't necessarily mean that we were leftists, but we always knew, even when we were talking about the middle class experience, that there was this fringe out there, actually a much larger fringe of other people who were also Filipinos, living very different lives. Hindi nawawala yun sa sensibility nung sinusulat namin. And of course, when I say namin, we were realists, so, or many of us were, so that would intrude. Lastly, I have the sense that we wrote with more emotion, or about more emotion, and emotion other than just anger or alienation. We wrote with feeling, about feeling. And this is something that I often tell my classes. Parang, minsan very clever yung trabaho, pero asan yung puso niyan? Parang asan yung tama? Kasi nga parang takot na talakayin yung, takot sa drama, basically. You know? So it's all very, very subtle, pero parang takot mag-engage sa, bakit takot kayo mag-iyakan? Bakit takot kayo magsigawan? Kasi na-train na tayo na parang walang kwenta yan eh. Kailangan matuto kang, to be more subtle. Saka sa subtle, na wala na talaga yung emosyon. Kasi kami, may mga background kami sa pelikula, sa peta, sa drama, kaya halo-halong lahat yan. Pagpasok sa kwento, o siguro kahit maski sa tula, hindi nawawala yung pakikiramdam sa katauhan at sa lipunan. Yun lamang po. Salamat.
Our next speaker is my former teacher. Elegant in prose and personality. Parang Miss Universe na tayo, no? 2016. No? Dr. Jing Hidalgo.
Thank you, Danton. Good afternoon. I have a few notes, so I'll just read them. I'm not good at extemporizing. I'm afraid of rambling. My writing career is not quite like Butch's, maybe, as he said, because there's a big difference between people who are of a certain age and on another age. Kung nasasabihin to which one I belong. My writing career, like that of most of the writers of my generation, had its beginnings in a campus paper. I was a reporter, then literary editor, and finally editor-in-chief of my high school paper. I also began publishing essays in the national magazines when I was a junior in high school. And the way it happened was through connections. Like my mother, who had been one of the first newspaper women of the country, had a friend who was the editor of a women's magazine, I guess is what it was. And she happened to mention to her friend that she had a daughter who fancied herself a writer. So this lady very kindly said, well, tell her to give me her work, which I did, and which she liked, or maybe she liked my mother. So she published that essay. And I felt that my career as a writer was launched. Then I moved to college. This was the UST Faculty of Philosophy and Letters, which is where many of the writers and journalists of the time were studying. And I got quickly disabused of any idea that I was a professional writer, because most of my classmates were already working journalists. They were working students. But the pattern for me was pretty much the same. I worked for my college's student paper first as features editor, and then I moved on to the university newspaper, the Varsitarian, where I began as a features editor and eventually became editor-in-chief. At the same time, there was, during that period, for the first time, newspapers were carrying youth sections or teenage sections. So I was invited to write a column, a weekly column, for that newspaper, the Manila Chronicle, and it had this pretentious title of "It's a Zany World," diba? Yun. That's pretty silly when I was a college student. But at the same time, I also got assignments, regular assignments from the editor of the lifestyle section to do more serious stuff. So I was, in a way, already a practicing journalist in college. Creative writing courses were not part of our curriculum then. There were certainly no creative writing degrees. And until I became a senior and the Edelberto and Edith Tiempo set up the first creative writing workshop in Siliman based on the Iowa workshop, there were no creative writing workshops either. So my generation and I, we basically taught ourselves how to write. By reading a lot, we had a lot of literature courses, and we had a set of very inspiring teachers who, though they were not teaching creative writing, knew that every day they faced students who dreamt of becoming writers. So they nourished those dreams. And we would show each other our work and critique each other as best we could. And then we would submit our stories or poems or essays to the Free Press or the Graphic. We never heard from the editors. So months and months later, either it suddenly was published or you never saw it again, which means, of course, it was thrown away, right? Only once do I remember hearing from Nick Joaquin, who was the literary editor of the Free Press. It was a story I was so proud of. I thought it was a good story, the best story I'd ever written. And it came back to me with a note on the upper right-hand corner. It said, this story should be cut by about 2/3. So really painful. But I had heard from the great man, right? So I did cut it, I revised it, I resubmitted it, and it was published. So I thought, wow, I have a chance to win the Free Press Short Story Award, right? And then martial law was declared. So the Free Press was closed down, and there went that. That story, though, became the title story of my first short story collection, The Ballad of the Lost Season. I took a long time to get up the nerve to publish short stories, actually, mainly because I didn't have the advantage of creative writing classes with feedback from professional writers. I had no idea whether I wrote well or not. So I was very brave about submitting essays, of course, creative nonfiction. That was easy for me, came very easily. But short stories, I agonized over them. So after my first story was published, I was probably already around 28 or something like that. It was published by Ninochka Rosca in the Graphic, who since then became, you know, the woman I love most. She gave me my first break, in other words. And then I would publish only one short story a year, agonizing over each one. It was always my ambition, though, to be a novelist. That was my dream. And, well, eventually I did get to write 2 novels, that's all. After graduation, I became briefly a journalist, and then I gave it up to become an instructor in my university, basically because I was getting married, and I thought it was difficult to combine the kind of schedule that journalists had with that of running a house and raising a family. So my full-time job since then has been teaching, and only occasionally have I gone back to journalism, both here and abroad in the countries where we live as part of my husband's work. I think, I don't remember that we spoke then of a literary community as such, or a literary scene. It wasn't the way it is now for the young writers, I think, who breaking into writing and publishing now. We were basically working just as small groups, maybe in different universities. I remember only going to only one book launching. It was the launching of The Hand of the Enemy, the book, the novel of Kirima Polotan, which had won the Stonehill Award. And by the way, she did not show up for her own launching, which was, and the reason for that, it was rumored, was because she did not like the man after whom the award was named, Harry Stonehill. So I lost the opportunity to meet this idol. No? In those days, it was also not very easy for us young writers to meet the older senior writers. So I had looked forward to it a great deal, only to be disappointed. When we left, when martial law was declared, of course you know that all the media was shut down, and then it was necessary to get a permit to be allowed to write again. And maybe you have heard about the crony press and the underground press and so on. We left the country in 1975 and lived abroad for 15 years. I published my first books while I was abroad. They had to come by diplomatic pouch. It was a very complicated process. Then the proofs were sent to me, and then they had to come back by diplomatic pouch. This was during the time of, it was martial law here. But when we returned in 1990, the scene had changed completely. EDSA had happened. There was a flowering of all the arts, including literature. There were so many publishing houses publishing literary works. In my time, there was only one. It was called New Day, run by Gloria Rodriguez. She was the only one publishing literary titles. When I came back, even the academic publishing houses were carrying literary titles, and there were other independent publishers. And then, of course, creative writing was not only a course taught in universities, there were degrees going all the way up to PhDs in creative writing. So I thought, wow, I was born too early. It would be so nice to be a writer now. That's all, I think.
Next, we have the horrible crook, Dr. Jimmy Abad.
When I got the invitation to be a member of this panel, I concentrated on the question, where is that? What literature and writing, or what was literature and writing so different before? I concentrated on that. And I thought, of course, both different and similar, because there is tradition and there is individual talent. That's all. Yeah. Yeah. What's tradition? Tradition is everything that has been accomplished by writers, including various experiments and innovations, from which present-day writers learn their craft. Individual talent has to do with one's own way with language. And this is where I think I'm coming from. For me, poetry is a way with language to transcend the inadequacies of language, to translate a reality that has been perceived or imagined. Yeah. Well, how? How does it do that? Only by means of the evocative power of the imagination. Then I think there is, that is not, language for me is the poet's muse. In fact, for every writer, for every artist, it's the medium that is his muse. For the sculptor, it's marble. For the music composer, sounds. For the painter, line and color and perspective, etc. It's the medium that is your muse. But in regard to the poet, there is an easy and simple way with language, and there is also a rich and complex way with language. When I say easy and simple, it is easy and simple only when it has been accomplished. Yeah. Well, okay. I want to illustrate. Sige nga, give me an example of a simple poem. Listen to this. Third World Opera by Simeon Dumdum Jr. It goes this way. When he kicked the governor, the applause was deafening. Everybody stood up and cheered. Even a baby cooed, so he thought. Such adulation he never had in his career. And it was for an act that his role had not demanded. Why? He was about to burst into song after kissing the leading lady when he saw the governor smiling in the front row. And he remembered the dictator, the governor's master, and his sins against the people. For his part, the governor deserved credit. That he loved Vivaldi, whom he thought painted the Last Supper, was well known. But better known was his passion for the theater. And the tragic thing that could happen was for one to think his honor a fool in matters of the stage. And so, when the actor descended in surprising haste and landed a rather realistic kick in his groin, he felt honored, marveling with gratitude at how much theater had progressed, and joined the crowd in the applause. Oh, there, very simple. Yeah. Easy and simple. But that's easy and simple only when it has been accomplished. Yeah. What about the rich and complex way? Oh, boy. By the way, that was in 1986, Simeon Dumdum. This one is 1954, Carlos Angeles, Landscape 2. Boy, it goes this way. Sun in the knife horizon bleeds the sky, spilling a peacock stain upon the sands. Across some murdered rocks refuse to die. It is your absence touches my sad hands, blinded like flags in the wreck of air. And catacombs of clouds enshroud the cool and calm involvement of the darkened plains. The stunted mourners hear, and here a full and universal tenderness which drains the soft and golden breath of sky comes bare. Now, as the dark basins devoid of space, some sudden crickets ambushing me near, discover vowels of your whispered face and subtly cry. I touch your absence here, remembering the speeches of your hair. Oh, there, 1954. Rich and complex. You know, language and what they call. Language is, you know, the finest invention of the imagination. Yeah, don't you think so? Without language, no memory, no history, no culture, no civilization. It's the finest invention of the imagination, language, which is the poet's muse. But language, if you consider it, it is an abstract system of representation. Only by way of the evocative power of the imagination do our words make real to the mind what the mind perceives or intuits. That philosopher, friends, Albert Camus, yeah, he says, when the imagination sleeps, words are emptied of their meaning. Don't you think so? When you come upon, for example, yeah, when you come upon the word daffodils. If you have no idea what it is, no image, it does not become real to you. But if you know that it's a flower, then at least you have an image of a flower. No? Then you can get the sense of the word. Yeah, it's for the reader and for the writer, it's work of the imagination. When the imagination sleeps, words are emptied of their meaning. Yeah. That's it.
Ano, Krip, magre-recite ka rin ng poem? Our last speaker is the gentleman in red, no? Mr. Krip Yuson.
Thanks, Danton. I guess I'm the only one at the table that Danton cannot claim to have been his professor. It doesn't mean that we're contemporary. Going to the title of the forum, the way we wrote was literature and writing, so different before. You will note, as Butch pointed out during a pre-discussion, literature and writing serve as one united subject that explains the was. I take it that we are supposed to try to highlight whatever differences, if any, there are between the times that we were writing as leaner and meaner practitioners of the craft and the present. No? In my case, that would be a difference of about 4 or 5 decades. No? As Butch also said earlier, I started writing professionally in the late 60s and went on to the 70s. When I first looked at the title of the panel, my initial reaction was that there can't be really much difference if you take it that literature, or say creative writing, fundamentally has still the same basic requirements, whether it was done in the 60s or in the 2016. Basically, I see it as threefold. One, there should be a certain level of intelligence in the writer. Two, a grasp of the language, if not a command of the language that one uses. And third, and last, a freshness of imagination that might ensure that one's articulation is distinct or unique. Given these three, then you're in business. You can be a writer, or you are already a writer. Those three fundamental requirements do not change over the years, over the decades, over the centuries. So basically, I can't say that there has been much difference. Another aspect is the fact that language, given only the gap of 5 decades, can't really be said to change much. No? We're not dealing here with leapfrogs of centuries, say comparing medieval English literature to the current. Certainly there have been changes in the syntax, even in points of grammar. But from the 60s to now, not much in terms of the use of the observance of grammar and syntactical necessities. Yes, in a way, there is a change in terms of the vocabulary that one uses now. There has certainly been an expansion in the last 50 years. I can't imagine that in the late 60s, if I were to write in Tagalog or Filipino, as I occasionally did, I could not very well have used the term pakganern, the way it is now. Or I would have used the verb load to mean its basic meaning, definition. And no such thing as low bat, and all the technological terms that we have now. So in terms of technological advancement, and also the incursion of a lot of what you might call pop neologisms, then certainly the language has been enriched, and you might be able to identify if you're reading a novel or a story that is set in the present than one that was set 5 decades earlier by the application of certain new terminology or verbiage. Other than that, I see 4 small aspects that might contribute to the differences between then and now. It's the first that intrigues me because it involves, it entails a certain physicality to it. That, I mean, I actually miss those days when we used to pound away on a typewriter. Okay, those heavy-set machines, with the keys so separate from one another, and which required a certain knowledge of mechanical rudiments, such as feeding it with a blank sheet and winding up the platen knob so that the top end appears at the other side of the roller feed. And then you have to adjust the margins, the indentations, before you start pounding away. And there was a physical passion involved when you pounded away. And it also entailed other details like learning how to handle the often messy contraption that was the ribbon, the typewriter ribbon, and the ribbon case. And I recall that when you actually went to a store and purchased a new ribbon, there was a feeling of triumph and excitement because you knew you had been writing a lot to have finished the last ribbon. And the frequency of your purchase of the ribbon was a kind of measure on how much involved you were as a writer. Then, of course, you had to learn how to put the carbon paper to produce instant multiple copies. Eventually also learned to handle what was called the snowflake correction fluid. Before the whiteout correction tape. Remember? So you love to exercise or go through the ritual, the physical ritual of this ceremony, this sacrament of writing. But what I miss most was, you learned to apply in terms of quick editing. Whenever you had to, the snowflake was used as an antidote to typos. Okay, but whenever you needed to insert a phrase or a line, this you could do if you had the foresight of typing in double or triple space, because you will insert the line, with a slash up there. Now, when push comes to shove, and your instant review of your work leads to frustration, and you think that that page is totally lost. Then here came the final act, of tearing up that sheet of paper, crumpling it into a ball, and tossing it into a corner where, more often than not, a trash can would be waiting for it. And here is where my previous skills in three-point shooting in the hard court, came to the fore. How often your accuracy with the trash can could determine, the end of your frustration in terms of original drafting. Anyway, from the time of the Underwoods, the Remingtons, the Smith Coronas, we all had to undergo going up that curve, educational curve, as technology caught on, and eventually you moved to the portable typewriter, lighter, tinny, and then the electric and electronic typewriter, until the computer age came, and we had to learn how to handle keyboards that were very separate from the screen, that had a greenish tint. Okay. And eventually, of course, we all wound up with laptops. And thanks to Butch's influence, I can say that all members of this panel and this table are purveyors of Apple products. Okay, I only have 3 minutes left. I'll rush to the last of my, what I think are also the differences. Apart from the physical contraption, the instrument of choice, basically there was a difference in terms of influence. Jimmy touched on this. When you were writing in the 60s, most of us were trying to channel Hemingway and E.E. Cummings. Okay? These days, I suspect that most young writers are trying to channel Murakami and, heavens no, Lang Leib. But I think that's what's happening now. So there's a difference in terms of the influences. A third aspect of the changes would be the material, what you call the material, the circumstantial atmosphere in which you live, the psycho-social, socio-political environment that surrounded you. Again, I can say that all the members of this panel have drawn from experiences of the martial law years in our prose and poetry both. And as I would imagine that the young and old writers of the current times are still trying to determine how they will draw the same from what's happening now. But already, I must make note, there is a writer friend of mine, a younger writer friend of mine from the South, who is already digitally anthologizing what he calls the Kill List Chronicles, and actually making it available on social media. Yeah. Very fast anthologizing. Of course, social media is a game changer. We didn't have it in our time, and so we were quite isolated as writers. The only times we managed to trade influences in terms of books, or talk about the material that we had at hand, was always face-to-face, eyeballing each other in campuses or beer houses or street corners. These days, it's much easier. You have all the access, so everything's happening fast. I think that's about it. Those are the differences with regards. Well, no, one important one. Sorry if I can have an extra minute. I will get from Jimmy's wasted 2 minutes. The more important difference has been the proliferation of genres. No? Again, in our time, we never wrote creative nonfiction. We wrote personal essays until Jing came into the picture and taught everyone to write creative nonfiction. There was no, chick lit was non-existent. Spec fict would be taking a page out of Bradbury or doing a number on Bradbury or Dick, Philip Dick. Now you have all these genres. You have the graphic novel, which is much in demand. You even have steampunk literature. So there's a proliferation of genres that one couldn't write for then. No? There has been a randomization and even, in fact, what I would call a mutation. When it comes to poetry, you have rap battle, you have open word, what do you call it? Open mic poetry, spoken word poetry, where the requirement now is not simply a matter of putting your lines into paper, but also putting them in your head, the way Jimmy Abad does, committing it to memory before actually reciting long pieces. So it's remarkable the way spoken word artists have been doing it. And it also includes all the so-called hugot lines. Maybe that is the major difference between the time when we wrote and the time that the writing is thriving now. Either we didn't have it or we didn't call it that, the hugot lines. Okay. Anyway, that's it for now. Yeah.
So our distinguished panel talked about sources, influences, the physical passion of writing, and traditions, not just tradition, but traditions and individual talent. We're now opening the floor to questions. So please state your name and your question. Maybe the more concrete the question, the better, and to whom the question is addressed. Una kayong matakot, mabait naman tong apat na to. Lalo na si Krip, napakabait ni Krip. No? Yes, please.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Nico Miguel M. Garcia. I'm from the Versitarian Literary Section. So here's my question to every one of you, but I would love to hear from Ma'am Jing. Given the present-day cutting-edge technology, particularly access to blogs and sites like Wattpad, WordPress, and even in social media like Facebook and Twitter, how has this become a boon, or perhaps a bane, with today's literature vis-a-vis the literature during your time? Thank you.
Is the question whether this is a bane or a boon, the proliferation of writing on the net in different, like the Wattpad and vlogs and so on? Yeah, I think it's a boon. I think that everything that helps, that produces more writing and more reading is good. My only qualm about the fact that it's so easy to do is that you don't work as hard as we had to produce it. Meaning to say, before we published before, and I'm not talking about gatekeepers or anything like that yet, just before we dared show our work even to each other, we spent a lot of time making sure that it was as good as we could make it. We had this, I don't know where it came from, maybe from our reading, maybe from our teachers, the idea that you don't show your work unless you're sure that it's good. it's like you don't sing lang even if you do not know how to sing, no? Or you're disentonado, or you've never been trained. Hindi ba yung, I don't like the karaoke culture, where anybody can sing and impose his singing on innocent bystanders. Ano? I find that that's an imposition on me. Because I paid good money to sit in that restaurant to eat food in peace. And then people start singing who sing badly. I think that's, I don't like that. And in the same manner, I would never think of imposing my writing on anyone, friend or foe, or stranger, or unknown person on the net, unless I was sure that it was good and it was not going to waste his time, which I'm afraid is something that you might have lost. Might have. I don't say all of you. But because it's so easy. You write something and then you post. And it's there na. And then if you later regret it, you delete it. So no harm done. Harm done, I think. Because you have revealed yourself for the lousy writer that you are. So that's the, di ba? At least, but I say that on the balance, it's still good, no? Because more people are reading than ever did before, and more people are writing than ever did before. And that can only be, for me, a good. So my suggestion lang is, mag-ingat ng konti. Pag-ingatan ng konti. Para wag kayo mapahiya. I cringe when I read something I've posted and then I see may mali pala. Kahit isang preposition lang. Babalikan ko yon, i-delete ko yung kaagad. And then I want to say, please forget what you read 5 minutes ago, di ba? Yun lang. Just be a little more careful about what you, so that you won't regret it and be ashamed of it later. Thank you.
Butch, the Mr. Techie.
People all have the same answer. Same answer.
Jimmy, Krip is eating something. Same? They're all friends. Oh, diba? Nothing to add. Jing has given a, yeah, you woke me up, Jing, with your such a lousy writer. Dami naman talagang pangit sa internet. No? Oh, Jimmy, you want... If bias ka lang, walang ED, you're biased, no?
If Franz Arcillana were here, no, and he reads something like that sa internet, Franz Arcillana would say, makes sense, get real. That's what he'll say.
Next question. Thank you.
Hi, my name is PJ. I just wanted to ask the panel in general, but anybody can answer the question. Can you give me an example of an author that you read often back then and an author whom you read often today? Is there a big difference between them, or do you think na merong similarity, may heritage, may transmission, or yeah, something like that?
Writers whom you read before and who do you read now? Is there a difference?
There's a big
As
difference.
you aged, no? Maybe that's the question.
Danton, may I take it? Yeah, initially. Yeah, in that span of time you could call my youth, I read Nick Joaquin a lot. These days, who can you compare? You know, whoever you read, malaking layo, malaking layo. Especially since most of what you read these days are either newspaper columns or, again, social media commentary. And even the fiction, as proliferative as it has become, there is still much difference between the prose that you used to glory in with regards to Nick Joaquin and what you read currently.
Jimmy?
Yeah. When I was in high school, somebody during a Christmas gift exchange, somebody gave me Robert Frost, no? And, you know, I was so entranced with Frost, I thought that to be a poet one might be a farmer first. So after graduation, I went to Los Baños to be a farmer, so that I can be a poet. That didn't work. Yeah. 2 years ago in Los Baños. And then in Los Baños, by the way, Robert Frost is the simple and easy way with language. And then in Los Baños, I was introduced to Gerard Manley Hopkins. Wow, that really floored me. Although I only half understood what he was, his poetry. But oh, so he's a Jesuit, huh? Ah, that's the way to be a poet. So I entered the Jesuit order. Yeah. Well, I didn't last. 3 years only. I left. No, I went to UP Diliman. Yeah. For AB English Literature. Yeah. And there, Franz Arciliana, NBM Gonzalez, Recarredo de Metilio, Alejandrino Hofana, that clinched it. Yeah, I finished my degree, etc. Yeah. So those were the poets that I read during those days. But up to now, I love those poets. Robert Frost, The Simple Way, Gerard Manley Hopkins, The Complex Way. Yeah.
Who did I used to read? I read the women most of all. So my idols were Kerima Polotan, Carmen Guerrero Nakpil, Edith Tiempo, Hilda Cordero Fernando. Who do I read now? And those women that I mentioned, I think they all influenced the way I write. I didn't realize how much until today when I reread my work and I see where each of them influenced me. Although I also read Nick Joaquin, everyone read Nick Joaquin. Who do I read now? I read you. I read Sian Abad. I read Nikki Alfar. I read Ichi Batacan and Sophie Lee. And I think you're just as good. You're different, very different, but just as good.
Anong say nyo, si Ian Abad? Wala. Butch.
I'll just talk about some of my earliest influences. I was largely self-taught because I was out of school for a long time. But since high school, the authors who influenced me most were people like W. Somerset Maugham, John Updike, Graham Greene. Among Filipino authors, Greg Brillantes and Ben Santos were the strongest influences on me. These are the people I read whenever I hit a wall in my own writing. I read them and I revel at their prose, and I tell myself I know that I can never write as good as them, and it relaxes me knowing that. So just do what you can, because these are my heroes. Among women writers, one of the writers I most admired was Nadine Gordimer. I love her stories. But the book, actually, the most influential book that I ever read, for reasons right or wrong, was The Forest by William Pomeroy, which I read in high school. And in the same way that Jimmy wanted to become a farmer, when I read The Forest, I said, I want to become a communist. and that's what happened, all because of this wonderfully, and perhaps in a sense deceptively lyrical book, The Forest by Pomeroy.
Just briefly, Butch, you were out of school for a while, but you came back to finish your AB and then
Yes.
MA. Did formal schooling help you with your writing for the sake of our teachers and students here?
It helped me. I went back to school less to become a writer than to become a teacher. Because at a certain point I said, I'd like to study some more and share that knowledge with other people. And that's what drove me back to school. I returned to school at 27, graduated with my BA at 30. And I think that was good because it exposed me to a whole lot of other things. Maybe not directly in terms of my prose, but in the way I reveled in literature. And it was actually my exposure, of all things, to English Renaissance drama and Renaissance poetry, Philip Sidney and all of these people, Shakespeare, Marlowe. And I said, my goodness. And I remembered specifically also people like Dylan, Thomas, Philip Larkin. These were people I wanted to hear over and over again. And I said, I just want to live here for the rest of my life. And that's basically what I've done since.
More questions from the floor. Ala, ang daay, sige. The lady at the near the
Yes, good
last row.
afternoon. My name is Amy. Miss Hidalgo, you said something at the end of your talk about how great it would be to write today. So may I ask the panel, if you were given a chance to start writing today, unlike in the past, would you take that chance?
Are you going to live your life again daw as a writer? Or as a talk show host?
Is the question, would I become a writer all over again if I live today? Yes. I have no other talent. I have no choice. I cannot even balance a checkbook. I don't know how to cook. I'm not a good singer. Walang ibang talent. Walang choice. Would I be a writer all over? Yes. And I think I'd have more fun now. No, more opportunities, more, more contact with each other, larger community. We even now have literary agents who can sell our books to foreign publishers. Absolutely, I would do it all over again.
Jimmy? What will... ano daw ang gagawin mo? Jesuit or farmer? Again.
No, I'm quite happy with myself already, so I don't think I would change course. Yeah, even if I want to redeem myself as a farmer, or no, I don't think I would change. Yeah, unless somebody interferes with my DNA. But no, I wouldn't change. Yeah.
Yeah, same answer as Jing. I would still be a writer. Well, especially since, if not for the current dispensation, I might have enjoyed being a drug lord.
Yeah, I actually wanted to be a scientist at some point, the Philippine Science High School, where my grade, as I say in English, was 1.0, my grade in math was 5.0. That more or less settled it for me. I did enter UP as an industrial engineering major. And again, my grade in English was 1, my grade in math was 5, because it wasn't going to classes anymore. But yeah, I think writing is a wonderful job. I mean, speaking of it as a job, I'm sure Krip and I will agree that we couldn't maybe have gone out there and literally seen the world if we weren't writers. I mean, writing opens doors that, that other jobs don't. We get, especially in our role as journalists, we see things, of course, both wonderful and horrifying. That in a sense is also a privilege. So we've led, I think, full lives because we're writers that working in another position wouldn't have allowed us.
Yeah, we have time for one last question. Ala, ang dami pa. Wag na yung mga kaibigan ng apat, diba? Oh, no, it's like this. We still have 15 minutes. Are we going to go the whole 15 minutes? Or 10 minutes pa raw, sabi ni Butch. Yes, please, sir.
My name is Al Vicente, and I'd like to put this question to our distinguished panelists. Given the environment and the interesting times that we have, I wonder if Filipino writers today could come up with works or pieces like Mantle's The Assassination of Margaret Thatcher, or Honig's The Senility of Vladimir P.
Well, my immediate response to that is that this afternoon, I'm really not on social media. I'm the last Pinoy without a Facebook account, but I am on Twitter, and I put out this tweet, and I said, these are the new 4 Ps. Pokemon, Putangina, Patayan, and Panelo. That's where we are. The novel will come much, much later, presuming we stay alive.
Drug Lord. Mga kakosa dyan, no? Ano ba? May comment ba tayo? Si Panelo, I interviewed him once, and the thing I was reading said Panuelo, so I called him Attorney Panuelo. He was so mad at me at 6 a.m., no? I wanted to ask, what were you smoking, no? At 6 a.m.? Jimmy? Why?
So, Ambassador, I'm not familiar with the work you cited, although I have heard of them. In a fit of generosity, perhaps the most that we can say that's a little pleasant about what's happening now is that we are being provided materials, and that it might not have to wait until the passage of time the way martial law did before Luwalhati Bautista produced Dekada 70. No? I think, in fact, it might even be written while it's still ongoing.
But seriously, I mean, I am very deeply bothered by what's going on, because this last month, that girl who was shot on the jeepney, she was family, and I was asked by Sarge here to write a piece on it for Esquire, and it actually took me more than a week to decide whether I should write or not. And of course, almost inevitably, I knew I had to, and that's probably coming out next month. But I did say there that it's a short step from a war on drugs to a war on words. And we don't know what's coming. I think right now, if we want to write that novel 10 years down the road, in a sense, we have to keep alive, but it's getting very tricky. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
Well, I'm Virgilio Reyes of the Department of Foreign Affairs. Previously, I'm probably a Nazi grammarian because it still bothers me that it would read was literature and writing, which means you equate them both with one entity, or were literature and writing, so different before. But I'm just wondering whether a difference could be that maybe globalization or economics or commercialization is fueling today's writing much more than before. Because before, if you were a writer, it was assumed that you would be probably a poor church mouse unless by sleight of hand you were as talented as Nick Joaquin, who could churn out biographies by the dozen. But isn't it fueled more by economics and making money and getting more likes on social media, etc.? Wouldn't that be a fundamental difference to what was before?
Thank you. O ano, gusto niya raw ng pera o mga likes daw sa Facebook? Ano, magtapatan na tayo dito.
Well, as someone who writes professionally, I don't think there's really a whole lot more money now in the writing business than there was before. I mean, there's still very few of us who can say that we write for a living. Of course, there are many, many more opportunities on Amazon, on Wattpad, and its derivatives when you hit the movies. So there's always the opportunity, but I don't really see anyone getting awfully rich from writing, especially a novel in this country. So I think the younger writers are still up pretty much against the same odds as we were before. The flip side of globalization is that you are one in millions, maybe millions of people who are now writing, whereas it used to be probably fewer relatively. So the competition is a whole lot stiffer. So the returns may not be all that commensurately great.
Kasi magagalit yan pag di ko pinagbigyan yan eh. One last question from the gentleman in black.
Curious lang ako, no? I'm Jack from the UST Publishing House. Kasi some parents would say that, not all, but whether they like it or not, parang they love a child, one child more than the others. So you're all writers of many works. Do you have a particular favorite of yours, of your work, which may not be popular when we talk about, let's say, if it's a best-selling work, or in other words, do you love one of your works better than the others? At saka yung pangalawa, which is, I think, more controversial, ano, how do you approach, let's say, because most of you are also in literary mentorship, no? You have students, mentees that you really need to teach or to mentor. How do you, let's say, if this particular person is not really meant or born to write, hindi lang, how do you go about it? Do you encourage, or do you say that, look for another job, or yun lang?
So which of your works daw are your favorite? And if you have a student who has no talent at all in writing, will you encourage him to be an accountant instead? So that's the question.
Oh, probably among my favorite works would probably be my short story penmanship. As for that benighted student, I would tell the student in so many words to explore other options, because even for the talented writer, life will be difficult enough. So it's doing that person a service to be realistic in our expectations.
My favorite of all my books is called Tales for a Rainy Night. It's a collection of short stories about the benighted student that Butch was talking about. I don't say it directly, but I tell my classes at the beginning, since we give you grades, maybe you can take the grades as a signal of how good or bad, how correct or how wrong this choice might be. So I say, if your grades get stuck at 2, forget it, right? 1.75, baka may chance pa. But 1.5 is the signal that, okay, there's a chance. I say that at the beginning so that I don't have to personally tell each one to go and, what did you say? Become a salesman? Become an accountant. Okay.
Do I have a favorite work? For now, my favorite would be In Ordinary Time. Yeah. And if you look at it, it's dedicated to a Jesuit. Making reparations. Yeah. Now, regarding a student who is not performing well, let us say, in a poetry class, there was a time, you know this, there was a time not performing well. So I told the student, gently, no? Maybe you can try creative nonfiction.
You know, actually it's true. This poor student came knocking on my door and then said, Ma'am, is this the class in creative nonfiction? Yes. I said, why? I was sent here by Dr. Abad. And then I said, why? Because he said, I'm not a poet po. Yun.
Well, you know, in Gonzales, our neighbor, I would show my short stories to him. There was one time he commented on my short story. He said, Jimmy, but he said it very gently, Jimmy, I think your story is constipated. So, he was my model.
Yung favorite book mo na sinulat mo, and if you have a student na walang ka-talent, anong gagawin mo?
As to works, I think you did mention it earlier in your question, they're like your children. No, you can't, even if you had, you really can't say, you know, or you shouldn't, you know. The others might get jealous. As for students, mentees, I don't know. I guess, personally, I feel that one always has to encourage them, no? No matter the vacuum in talent, you know, parang, you never really know. You know, something might happen and they might, you know, if people can, if certain distinguished people failed at farming and being a Jesuit, you know, still reach where they are now, you know, who am I to tell someone to go and plant kamote instead, no? Parang you encourage anyone regarding his or her desideratum or wish for a vocation or profession. No? Something might happen.
Yeah, I remember that planting kamote, that was a UP workshop with the late Dr. Ricaredo Demetilio, no? He said to a poet that you should move from culture to agriculture, no? So I think we will end on that agricultural note, no? We'd like to thank our wonderful panel, Dr. Butch Dalisay, Dr. Jing Hidalgo, Dr. Jimmy Abad, and our dear Krip Yuson. Thank you for being a wonderful audience. Thank you.